What did people actually use before toilet paper existed? It's March 2020. You walk into a grocery store and stop. Something's wrong. People are moving fast. A few are arguing. Then you see why. An entire aisle, completely empty. Not the snacks, not the drinks, the toilet paper. Shelves that have been full your entire life, wiped clean in a matter of hours. Strangers are filling entire carts. Someone is arguing over the last package on the shelf. For a few strange weeks, a civilization with satellites in orbit and computers in every pocket was gripped by a strange, primal kind of panic. All over a single roll of paper, but almost nobody stopped to ask the real question. For over 99% of human history, there was no toilet paper shortage. There was no toilet paper at all. Not one sheet anywhere on Earth. So what did every human being who has ever lived for nearly the entire existence of our species actually do? You're about to find out. And the real answer is stranger, more dangerous, and far more clever than you think. Let's start with the assumption most people make without even realizing it. Leaves, right? Just grab a leaf. It sounds so simple that it barely feels like a question worth asking. But the moment you actually try to live inside this problem, a dozen smaller problems appear out of nowhere. What if there are no leaves? What if it's the dead of winter and every tree for 1,000 miles is bare? What if you are a sailor, 3 weeks from the nearest coastline, with nothing around you but salt water in every direction? What if you live somewhere so far north that almost nothing grows there at all for most of the year? And even when you do find a leaf, which one? Grab the wrong plant and you haven't solved your problem. You've created a much worse one. Poison ivy does not care how desperate you are. Now stretch this same question across every climate on the planet, every culture, every century of human existence, going back further than written history itself. Suddenly, just grab a leaf doesn't sound so simple anymore. This is a problem every single human being who has ever lived has had to solve multiple times a day for their entire life. And for most of that history, there was no product, no packaging, no aisle to walk down, just you, whatever happened to be around you, and your own ingenuity. And sometimes, ingenuity wasn't enough. Sometimes, the solution people found came with a hidden price. In the far north, where trees and leaves and grass simply don't exist for most of the year, some Arctic peoples turned to the one material they had in truly endless supply: snow. It sounds almost too simple to actually work, but packed snow, used carefully, is surprisingly effective. Cold, yes. Deeply unpleasant, absolutely, but effective enough that it remained in use for generation after generation, in places where nothing else was ever an option. In drier regions, people reached for what was under their feet instead: smooth stones, worn pebbles, chosen carefully for the right shape and the right edge. And across huge parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, one solution turned out to be older, simpler, and far more enduring than almost anything humans would later invent: water, poured, scooped, or channeled by hand. A method so old that nobody can point to the exact moment it began. It's simply always been there. For well over 1 billion people alive right now, it still is the answer. But not every early solution was this gentle. Some hid a much darker secret just beneath the surface. Let's go to ancient Rome. Public restrooms in Roman cities were nothing like the private little rooms you're picturing. There were long stone benches with rows of holes cut into them, side by side, where dozens of strangers sat together at the same time, talking, doing business, completely, unapologetically in public. And resting nearby, usually in a shared bucket of vinegar or salted water, was a tool called a tersorium, a natural sponge tied to the end of a stick. You would use it, rinse it in the bucket, and put it back. For the next person, sit with that for a second. An entire city sharing the same handful of tools, day after day, dipped again and again into the same bucket. It solved the immediate problem instantly, but it created a much bigger one, hiding invisibly just beneath the surface. Bacteria, parasites, infection, passed silently from stranger to stranger in a way absolutely nobody at the time understood or could even see coming. One clever solution, one massive, invisible new danger, and this is going to become a pattern. Not far away, in ancient Greece, people often reached for something even simpler: smooth, broken pieces of pottery, worn down at the edges. Archaeologists have even turned up examples with something scratched into the surface. A name, sometimes a political rival, someone the owner clearly didn't think much of. Make of that what you will. Now picture something even more extreme: A wooden ship somewhere in the middle of the open Atlantic centuries ago. No land for weeks in any direction. No plants, no fresh water to spare on anything but drinking and cooking. Sailors solved this problem using something already hanging off the side of the ship. The frayed end of an old length of rope trailed through the ocean behind the vessel. The entire crew shared it, officers and deckhands alike. It was salty, rough, constantly wet. Was it comfortable? Not even slightly. Was it hygienic by any modern standard? Also no. But on a ship where almost nothing else existed, it worked well enough to matter, voyage after voyage, for generations of sailors. Every environment on Earth forced humans to invent a slightly different answer to the same private question, and nearly every answer came with a hidden cost baked into it. But here's where the story widens into something much bigger than any one person's personal habits. Because the wiping was never really the hard part. Getting rid of everything afterward, in a crowded city full of other people doing the exact same thing, that was the problem that could bring an entire civilization to its knees. Picture a crowded medieval town. Thousands of people, packed into narrow streets with no sewer system connecting any of it. Waste had to go somewhere. And in a lot of places, that somewhere was simply out the window. In cities like Edinburgh, residents would shout a warning before emptying a chamber pot from an upper floor. Gardy loo, a corruption of a French phrase meaning roughly, watch out for the water. If you heard it and didn't move fast enough, you learned a deeply unpleasant lesson about looking up at the wrong moment. Other towns employed workers with one of history's least enviable job titles, gong farmers. Their entire profession was climbing into cesspits, almost always at night, and hauling the contents out by hand. Multiply this across every growing city in the medieval world, and you get something far more dangerous than bad smells. You get contaminated water supplies. You get conditions that helped fuel some of the deadliest outbreaks in human history. It even reached all the way to London, centuries later. In the summer of 1858, the smell rising from the heavily polluted River Thames grew so overwhelming that it was recorded as disrupting sessions of Parliament itself. Historians call it the Great Stink. And it was bad enough, embarrassing enough, that it finally forced the construction of a modern sewer system that would reshape the entire city. One tiny, private, everyday act, multiplied across millions of people, helped quietly shape the layout of cities, the spread of disease, and eventually the birth of modern sanitation engineering. Nobody ever expects that the answer to what did people use before toilet paper eventually leads to the story of how London rebuilt itself from underground. But it does. Now, here's where the story takes a turn almost nobody sees coming, because this was never only a story about survival, it was also, unmistakably, a story about class, status, power. Not everyone was reaching for a shared sponge or a scratchy length of rope. If you happen to be wealthy, or better yet, royal, your daily experience with this exact same universal problem could look almost unrecognizable. In parts of medieval Europe, the rich used soft wool, sometimes even scented with rosewater. The poor made do with hay, straw, moss, or whatever scraps of cloth they could spare. And in Tudor England, this everyday act became so tightly bound up with royal power that an entire official position at court was built around it. It was called the Groom of the Stool. Yes, that was a real job title, and it was not a punishment. It was one of the single most envied positions in the entire royal household. Why would anyone want it? Because the person holding that title had private, unsupervised, daily access to the king at one of the only moments he was ever truly alone. Which meant access to his mood, his unfiltered thoughts, sometimes his secrets. Nobles didn't avoid this position, they competed for it. It came bundled with land, with titles, with genuine political influence at the very center of the English crown. A job built entirely around royal bathroom hygiene became one of the most quietly powerful roles in an entire kingdom. Nobody expects that walking in, but it's completely true. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the world, one civilization had already discovered something the rest of the planet wouldn't seriously consider for another 1,000 years or more. Paper. In China, as early as the 6th century, wealthy households had already begun using paper for exactly this purpose. By some historical accounts, one emperor's household alone used hundreds of thousands of sheets a year, some of it specially perfumed, produced solely for the emperor himself. Toilet paper, in other words, already existed, over 1,000 years before most of the rest of the world would even think to try it. But there was a catch. At the time, paper was extraordinarily labor-intensive to produce. It was a genuine luxury item, reserved almost exclusively for emperors, nobles, and the extraordinarily wealthy. For absolutely everyone else on every other continent, the search continued. Leaves, water, stone, wool, snow, rope, whatever the world around them happened to provide. The idea of paper as an everyday household product available to ordinary people wouldn't arrive for centuries. And when it finally did, it wouldn't come from a palace. It would come from a farm. By the 1700s and 1800s, families across colonial and early America had already found their own answer. Dried corn cobs, split down the middle. Rough, but surprisingly functional, and something nearly every farm already had, sitting around in enormous supply. But by the mid-1800s, something else started appearing in outhouses across the country. Paper. At first, old newspapers, and soon after, something that would become a genuine cultural fixture, the Sears Roebuck catalog. For generations of American families, that thick mail-order catalog wasn't just for shopping. Once you'd finished with it, it had a second life, hanging from a nail in the outhouse. Softish pages, seemingly endless in supply, arriving free in the mail every single year, like clockwork. It became such a deeply ingrained part of rural American life that when Sears switched to thinner, glossy, coated paper in the 1930s, it wasn't a minor inconvenience. It broke a household ritual that had lasted for generations. Families were genuinely upset. Glossy paper simply didn't work the same way, and everyone who relied on it noticed immediately. One printing decision, made in a corporate office hundreds of miles away, accidentally created a small household crisis in homes across the entire country. But by then, something else had already begun quietly changing everything. In 1857, a man named Joseph Gaiety introduced what's widely considered the first commercially packaged toilet paper sold in the United States. And he was so determined to put his name behind it that he printed it directly onto every single sheet. Try to picture that. Your own name, watermarked again and again onto a product almost nobody wanted to admit they were buying. Then, in 1890, the Scott Paper Company took things a step further and began selling toilet paper on a roll for the very first time. Here's the strange part. Scott was so embarrassed by the product, so nervous about being publicly associated with it, that for years the company refused to put its own name anywhere on the packaging. Think about that. A company built an entire growing business around one of the most universal human needs on the planet and was too ashamed to publicly admit they made it. That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about why this history stayed so hidden for so long. It was never that this story didn't matter. It's that for most of modern history, almost nobody wanted to talk about it out loud. And even after toilet paper existed, it still wasn't finished evolving. Early manufacturing wasn't especially refined. The wood pulp used to produce the earliest rolls sometimes contained something you would never expect to find in a bathroom product. Actual splinters. Real, physical, wooden splinters. It was such a widespread, genuinely painful problem that in 1935, a company called Northern Tissue built an entire advertising campaign around a single promise. Splinter-free. Take a moment to really sit with that. An entire marketing campaign existed because the alternative was a real, physical, unpleasant risk. It's a small, almost funny detail, but it says something enormous about exactly how new, how imperfect, and how genuinely recent this so-called basic convenience actually is. From there, the product kept evolving. Softer, thicker, multiple layers. What began as one embarrassed company's experiment eventually grew into a global industry worth tens of billions of dollars a year, which brings us to the biggest twist in the entire story. You might assume that, by now, humanity solved this problem once and for all, that the rest of the world eventually caught up and everyone settled on the same solution. They didn't. Even today, the majority of people alive on Earth do not primarily use paper at all. Across huge parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, water remains the most common method, using nothing more than a simple container, a hose, or a built-in bidet, exactly as it has been for well over 1,000 years. From a global perspective, that toilet paper aisle that caused a full-blown panic in 2020 was never actually the world's default. It's a regional habit, a relatively young one at that, barely 150 years old, inside a species that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. So step back for a second and look at the true shape of this entire story. Every single culture in every corner of the planet facing the same private, universal, unavoidable problem, came up with a completely different answer, shaped entirely by whatever the world around them happened to provide. Snow in the Arctic, water along the rivers of Asia and beyond, wool inside the castles of medieval Europe, corn cobs on the farms of early America, paper in the palace of a Chinese emperor more than 1,000 years before anyone else would even consider it. None of these solutions were universal. Every single one of them worked in its own place in its own time. And notice something else hiding underneath all of it. This tiny, unglamorous, almost embarrassing daily habit tracks some of the biggest forces in all of human history without anyone realizing it. Disease and the rise of public health, wealth and class, trade and the spread of new technology. Even political power, all the way up to the royal court of England. A story this enormous was hiding inside one of the smallest, most private moments of your entire day. And almost nobody ever thought to look for it, because for most of history, we were simply too embarrassed to ask the question out loud. Which brings us back to March 2020, back to that empty aisle. In that moment, without even realizing it, an entire modern civilization briefly rediscovered something every generation before ours already understood instinctively. The real answer to this problem was never actually about the product itself. It was about whatever happened to be on hand, and the willingness to make it work. Water, leaves, snow, wool, rope, paper, ingenuity. Every single one of your ancestors, going back further than written history itself, solved this same private problem. Every single day of their lives without ever once touching a roll of toilet paper. And they survived. They built empires, they wrote philosophy, raised families, fell in love, started wars and ended them, all while endlessly solving the same small, universal problem, in whatever way the world in front of them allowed. So, the next time you reach for a roll without giving it a second thought, remember this. You're not just performing some small modern convenience. You're taking part in one of the oldest, strangest, and most quietly fascinating stories our entire species has ever lived through. We tend to measure history by its wars, its inventions, and its empires. But sometimes the truest measure of how far we've come is hiding in the smallest, most private moment of an ordinary day. The one experience every human being who has ever lived has shared in common and quietly, cleverly, found their own way to solve.